Okay, so for this technique, I'm going to show you guys how to do something that's called positive and negative space. That's just what I call it, but it's when you're focused on only rendering the negative spaces between the objects, right? So with negative space, it's anything that isn't an essential part of the composition, right? So you're going to see an image of a kind of fake plant and a mason jar that I've worked out, and I have a little bit of a sketch of my drawing just to kind of give you guys some reference points. But with this technique, it's pretty fun, but you're only rendering out the negative space shapes between the objects, right? So I know I have a little bit of a sketch here, but it's just so you guys can see. I'm going to use my vine charcoal. You're also welcome to use compressed charcoal, mainly because that's going to get you the quickest results, the fastest. If you use your pencil, you're going to be shading a lot more, so I just kind of like to, go for the most supple that I can think of. So I'm only going to render the negative space shapes, right? So I'm not necessarily focused on rendering the contours that I see of the actual objects, and even though you kind of are, because you're still you're focusing right next to them, I'm only going to develop this part of the space, right? And I'm going to show you in just a little bit what I mean by that. So I'm going to go along and kind of gesture. I'm going to go a little quicker than probably what you guys are going to do on your own, just for the sake of demo, right? So I'm only focused on the shapes that are the negative spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to either take the width of my piece of vine charcoal and kind of start working in that big expanse. You can kind of work out using the edge to kind of cut through. You can also just use the very point of a vine charcoal or compressed charcoal just until you get those contours worked in. And of course you can kind of smudge around, right? So what should be left in this kind of drawing is this kind of positive image of what was originally there, right? So I'm going to work on this little bit of a branch right here. I know vine charcoal isn't the most pretty sound, right? And so then I'm going to start developing everything outside of that. So then what's going to happen is the white of the page is going to be your positive object, right? So it's kind of just playing with the idea of what you render in a drawing. So, your positive application becomes what is the negative space, right? So it kind of gives you an idea about things that you can do when you're working on a drawing that isn't just one technique, and kind of ways to render and differentiate between different spaces, right? So, in some of the critique comments, when I say to you guys, how would you develop the negative space? Maybe this is something that you do where you develop that tone, or maybe even it's a type of rhythm around it, right? So the more that you work in this kind of way, the more you can kind of play around with what exactly that means, right? So for instance, if I have a big open space, maybe it's just right next to the edges that I, have that really dark tone, and then I kind of fade out to a little bit of a gray area. You can also use what's called a reductive technique, right? So if you get too heavy-handed with this application, you can pull those positive shapes back out just by erasing back to the tone of the page. But what's going to happen with this technique, so I'm going to do a little bit of a leaf here, kind of going around. I have a little leaf right here, and it's a little hard to see sometimes when you're rendering this out. Oh, I got too much tone there. You're just going for the negative space shapes, right? So anything that's an overlap can count, right? So I have this leaf that overlaps here. I actually have a stick that overlaps here that I kind of forgot about. I'm going to work that back in using my kneaded eraser for this, because kneaded erasers and vine charcoal get along really well. Have that little bit of a stick to pull back in, right? So these are two overlapped leaves, but I'm just going to leave that shape, and I'm going to actually darken up that tone quite a bit just to kind of give it that oomph. Right? So it's only the spaces between. So on the other side of this stick, I have another kind of shape. And the benefit to doing something like this is, one, it can create pretty interesting drawings, but the main reason we do it is to get you to see that a lot of the times the negative space shapes are a little easier to draw between complex objects. So especially leaves. If you're struggling to get, the distance between a leaf or the proportions of a leaf, look at the negative space shape. So like this one right here is pretty much a trapezoid, or a four-cornered kind of thing, shape. That's a lot easier for me to draw than the lumps and bumps of the contour, right? So that kind of stem of that leaf is coming out no problem, even though I just drew the space between, right? So something like this is not only can create pretty interesting drawings, but it can help you find the contour of things that are a little bit more challenging that, maybe before you couldn't necessarily quite pin down, right? So I'm gonna work on this just a little bit longer, because I don't want this video to be too awfully long, right? So I'm gonna kind of render this negative space shape a little bit differently than the other one. I know I'm just doing the stems right now, and that's not the most exciting thing, right? But let's say for this one, this is a piece of compressed charcoal. You guys can see how much richer it is. Maybe this one I'm just doing bands of tone, right? So how you develop the negative space in these types of drawings is completely up to you, right? But the main focus is, like, this is part of the fun, kind of figuring out new ways to render the positive negative space, but also just to kind of see that when you're drawing, looking at the negative space between objects and around them can inform you more about what those objects actually look like and how to draw them, right? So it's a great kind of technique. I love looking for negative space shapes because this is a lot easier for me to draw than just focusing on the outer edges, right? And sometimes when you're working from a still life, it is really hard to see what those edges actually are, right? So doing something like this can be a lot more fun and simple for you, right? So I kind of rendered that in. I'm gonna work on just a few more leaves here just to kind of show you. So I have another leaf that picks up here. These are kind of heart-shaped leaves. Something else too, if you guys are really interested in making your own still lifes at home, which is always a good idea, using what you have around you. But if you ever want some kind of foliage in your still life and you're like, it's not quite that time of year, things go on sale at craft stores, right? And so usually when they go on sale for me, I tend to just pick up the really cheap and inexpensive ones, and it just kind of gives you more to work with, right? So this one I got for like $2 at a craft store, and it's pretty interesting. It's got a lot to work with, and it's just a great way to kind of add more color into a still life, especially if you don't have like a lot of colorful bright things around you, right? So here's another shape that I had. This is multiple leaves, right? These three curves are the starts to leaves, and this is kind of a compilation of leaves and sticks, right? So I kind of have two smaller triangles in here. That's going to inform me more. Here's like a little bud that's in the fake plant, and then here's the actual stem part, right? So you guys can kind of see as I'm working that it's starting to come more and more into shape. But negative space technique in a nutshell. So again, negative spaces are the spaces between, around, and behind objects, and the positive space is usually what you're drawing, but for this exercise you're kind of flipping it. So you're only going to render in the negative space between and focus on doing that instead of each specific contour, right? So with this kind of tangled mess, I'm going to leave that as a flat shape. So even though I'm not getting all the detail, I can still kind of get a sense of what this looks like. Same thing with this glass jar. Even though, I'm not going to render all the like transparency in between, I still get the idea just from like the outline and the contour that this is a specific type of jar, right? Mason jars are usually pretty iconic when it comes to their shape. So it gives you an idea, even more information specificity in your drawing, even though you're not rendering every single aspect. Another thing too is you can use more of that reductive technique, right? So, sorry, I keep blowing my charcoal dust. So, if you go too far, like I have a line here, you can just kind of clean up or even draw with your eraser. Kneaded erasers are great for this, right? So if you need to like work back in and kind of clean up an edge, or push those lines back, or if you messed up and you're like, oh, that's not really where that is, you can kind of push and pull that way by using more of a reductive technique. But positive and negative space in a nutshell.